kiddos. So today we are going to talk about the Great Depression and New Deal programs between 1929 and 1939. So some context for the Great Depression, we obviously have to talk about the boom of the 1920s and a lot of that economic fiscal policy, kind of just like an overall, like their underlying causes of a weak economy that people had not quite anticipated how bad a recession could lead to a depression, starting after really kind of like after the stock market crashes. And remember that the stock market is kind of an indicator or a symptom of a far sicker economy around 1929 into 1930. The most important thing to understand about the Great Depression is it is a turning point in American political history. So before 1932, really all the way up to Lincoln's election in 1860, you've had a Republican majority for the most part. Republicans have controlled the House and the Senate and the White House more so than the Democratic Party. A lot of that has to do with the Second Industrial Revolution and kind of the Gilded Age politics. Kind of that transition of laissez-faire politics to Teddy Roosevelt and using his bully pulpit to push progressive reforms to kind of like, capitalism isn't perfect, but if we have certain government regulations, it will be better for all Americans, and Republicans kind of agreed with that. But again, like the Republican Party, their number one goal between the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, and the 1920s was definitely this view of let the economy kind of regulate itself. The federal government doesn't need to come in and put burden on businesses. Instead, the government needs to aid businesses. So tariffs obviously are going to play a role in that. After 1932, though, it's a turning point, because after that, you're going to have for pretty much like 30 to 50 years of Democratic control, okay? Where the Democratic Party is going to control the House of Representatives, the Senate, the White House for the majority of those years. And we're talking about big government. FDR was really inspired by his distant cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, of using his position in the executive branch to like drive legislation. And he believed that the Republican view of kind of like do little, like just let it work itself out, let the Depression work itself out, that wasn't going to happen. Instead, to use the federal government to help the American people. And really, it's a turning point, because that is how we view government today. Even conservatives are critical of it, but for the vast majority, there are certain programs that exist today because of New Deal policies that even Republicans and Democrats realize like we can't touch. Like that's something that does benefit Americans, even though there are flaws in the system, that we're not going to touch those programs such as Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, et cetera, which are very expensive programs. So we're going to talk about the history of those programs, and we're going to talk about the impact that it had on this decade, really. And of course, this occurs all before America's entry into World War II. And so at the end, we'll kind of talk about, did these policies work, and was FDR right? Okay. So very, very important in understanding that the stock market crash in 1929 did not cause the Great Depression. There were a lot of underlying causes. Now, the crash in 1929 for sure triggered the turmoil, because what it did is it brought to light all of these issues that were going on behind the scenes in the economy, but it alone was not responsible for the Depression itself. It just kind of is that indicator. We kind of use that as an event that kind of marks the beginning of the Depression. So the real causes of the Great Depression are uneven distribution of income between the top earners and the majority of Americans, stock market speculation, so buying and selling in the stock market during this bull market to earn quick profits. A lot of Americans, because of the consumerism that drove the 1920s, have an excessive amount of credit. So a lot of Americans are in debt throughout the 1920s, and that obviously is going to hurt them during the Depression if they lose their job or their home or whatever. The overproduction of consumer goods is going to drive down the demand, and then you don't have people stop buying, which means that's going to affect businesses and then lead to unemployment. The poor farmers are still struggling. They had some success during World War I, but they kept that supply high, which is going to drive down the prices. And it's going to be a very difficult decade in the 1920s for farmers, in addition to in the 1930s, because of other reasons as well. Government policies of not regulating the banks and not regulating businesses to a certain extent, and then the high tariffs are all going to add to the downfall of the United States economy during the Great Depression. And then the last one is just the globalization that's going to exist basically after World War I, an effect of imperialism and the United States selling their goods to other countries. And that was kind of their goal in economic expansion. So think of China and think of all the territories that they collected during like the Spanish-American War. So now you have this global economy. So when one country falls into depression, how does that affect the other countries? And so you're going to have a global depression because of that. And then again, that's just gonna add to the difficulty. So let's start with this crash on Wall Street in October, November of 1929. So in the 1920s, there's this bull market, right? It becomes the symbol, the source of wealth. It's the boom of the 1920s. It means that the stock market, yes, it has little dips and, plateaus or whatever, but overall, the market is going up pretty consistently. I would also say that we've been in a bull market probably the last 4 or 5, probably like the last 6 years or so, where the stock market is just continually going up. The Dow Jones Industrial, so if you've probably heard this phrase before, like the Dow or the Dow Jones, that is a collection of like the top, I think it's like 40, the average of 40 companies and how they're doing in regards to people investing in their companies. So it's going to hit a record high of 381 points on September 3rd, 1929. For perspective, here in the year 2021, I think the stock market is teetering at around like over 30,000 points. So back in 1929, 381 points. An average investor is going to purchase about $1,000 worth of stock in November of 1928, would have doubled their money in less than a year. Like that's how, and that's not normally how the stock market goes. Sometimes it takes, years or decades to be able to double your money on the stock market. But in the 1920s, it's a bull market. People are buying, which drives the prices up, which makes the trend go up. Okay. Now, before the crash, the stock market is going to fluctuate a little bit, which is kind of an indicator to investors like, well, what's going on with these businesses? But still, they keep their money in because they're not quite worried about it yet. However, October 24th, there was this unprecedented volume of selling. Investors were worried about, and this would also be kind of like in your quarterly projections. So like probably companies were reporting back like, well, sales are low, or, we've had to lay off workers or whatever it might be. And that might have prompted people to sell. Now, in order to stabilize those prices, bankers then, they saw it as an opportunity. Well, like if people are selling and the market's coming down, if it's coming down, this is a good time to buy, right? So they come in and they buy and it goes back up. And it worked for that Friday. Monday, people start selling again. And then on Black Tuesday, October 29th, millions of investors order their brokers to start selling their stock. They want to cash out. They feel like they've ridden the bull as long as they can. The problem is with this, and this is why confidence is really important, and hopefully why we won't have a crash like this again, is that if you just keep your money in and you don't worry about what, or try not to, I guess, have more trust that other investors will realize that the best thing for everyone is to keep their money in. At this point, like because this was an unprecedented bull market, A lot of, I think, investors and people didn't realize the impact that it would have once they sold. So by late November, so basically a month later, the Dow Jones was at 198 points within 3 years. So the height of the Great Depression, it would hit bottom, I think, in 1932 at 41 points. Okay. So all of the people, so what does that mean if the stock market crashes? So there's some people that made out okay, the people that sold their stock, right? When all of this frenzy started to happen. Typically those people are going to be wealthier people. They're going to have connections. They're going to have brokers that work directly for them and have that connection. Any type of like average American that was just like investing in the stock market probably lost everything. Because remember, it's not like you have your phone and you can like watch everything like on your phone and sell yourself. They didn't have that ability. So wealthy people that had the right connections got their money out, probably made some money. But a lot of people lost their entire savings or their retirement in that stock market crash. So if you lose, your savings there, that's obviously going to affect how you view, like, we're going to talk about money in the bank and things like that. So that's the stock market crash. In addition, there are all these underlying conditions. So even though wages were higher in the 1920s, and we talked about how the standard of living was better, like, in cities, in the suburbs, like you had electricity and you might have had running water. A lot of Americans still didn't have that. But overall, like if you were living in a city and especially in the suburbs and you had a white collar job, like life was good. Like you probably, this did really like hit middle class America pretty hard, because to them, everything looked like everything was picture perfect. But in reality, there was a lot of poverty that still existed. So wages did go up, but in comparison to the increase in productivity, so producing more goods, and then also corporate profits. So a lot of the money was going up to the top. So there was an increase in corporate profits in the 1920s. Those were up 65%, compared to wages were only up 8%. So you would want that to be kind of a little bit more balanced, right? So maybe corporate profits are up 40% and wages are up 15%, something a little bit closer, because when you look at a consumer-based economy, you need Americans to be buying these consumer goods. And we'll talk about that with the consumer revolution. So the top 5% of the richest Americans received 33% of all the income, which means that 95% of Americans had a smaller piece of the pie in regards to the wealth that they had. So their salaries and their wages were lower, which means that their paychecks didn't go as far, right? Which means when they have these products that are producing and they're overproducing, the supply is high of radios and refrigerators and anything and everything that you could think about buying at this point in time. The supply of those things are high, but the demand is going to drop, because a lot of these Americans have already been convinced by 1929 that they need to buy these things. Well, I just bought a radio 4 years ago. I don't need another radio. Like, it works just fine. And so the demand for those goods starts to go down. Well, if the demand for these goods goes down and they can't sell them anymore, that's going to drive the price down, and it's going to lead to layoffs, and then this kind of like downward spiral. If people are unemployed, they're going to save onto their money. They're not going to go out and spend it. And in the 1920s, it establishes this culture of we must spend money in order to, like, consumerism is really important. We have to spend money in order to maintain this, roaring 20s economic, like this life, this standard of living. So one of the other issues going on in the 1920s is going to be stock market speculation. So speculation is buying and selling stock to make a quick profit versus, which is kind of the purpose of the stock market, is that it's kind of like a long-term investment, that you're investing in this company for the long haul. Like if we think about today, like a lot of people, like, we use our retirements invested in the stock market. When you buy and sell for quick profits, when you play the market, it creates a lot of uncertainty for those businesses, those corporations. But then also like in the market itself, it opens the door for this drop in consumer confidence, which then could prompt a selling frenzy like what happened on Black Tuesday. In addition to that, buying on margin was this crazy idea that in this bull market, it was a sure thing. Like you're going to make money off of the stock market. Like just go all in. Like if your money's sitting in the bank, that's a waste of time. It should be in the stock market. And some people went as far as taking out loans to invest in the stock market, sell when it gets high enough, sell it, pay back your loan, and then have more money to reinvest. And so, I mean, you could just make a down payment of 10% in order to kind of like borrow that money. And it's good, I guess, when you're in a bull market, right? It's like borrowing 10 grand and going to Vegas and gambling, like, okay. But what happens when it drops and you're out of luck? Like not only did you lose money, but you owe money to someone, like you are in debt. And so that's going to create a problem, obviously, after the crash in 1929. One of the real causes of this underlying like superficial prosperity of the time, I think, is also this excessive use of credit and installment buying. American or a lot of these industries and manufacturers had realized like, okay, we're producing all these goods. We have to keep selling them at this rate. We're able to, our production is really high. We're very efficient. We can get prices down pretty low in order to be able to reach more people. But how can we sell to even more people? Because remember, wages are higher, but for the vast majority of Americans, they're still pretty low. Like they can't necessarily buy in cash a Model T and a refrigerator and a radio and all of these things. Instead, what these businesses did is they encouraged installment buying or the use of credit. So, hey, you don't need to be able to afford the Model T right now. Instead, how about like 6 easy payments of whatever? Sometimes they charge interest. Like where we've gotten today in society is what you'll notice is that, people can't afford to pay the interest on, furniture or an appliance. So instead, what the company will do is like, hey, we'll give you 12 months finance free. So you just make your $100 payment or whatever it is for the first, year, and you don't have to pay any interest. And then they trick you, right? Where it's like you get in this habit and then all of a sudden you got 20% interest on it. And that's why I think like credit card debt is a really big problem for Americans today because they make it so easy for you to buy whatever it is you want. And that was the goal in the 1920s. Like, these aren't things that you need necessarily, but you want it and you can afford it, so you should buy it. And that's how they kept people buying their goods. Now, eventually, when you get to like after the stock market crash and like people start losing their jobs, is when they start getting more conservative and they say like, I've been overspending. But the problem is when you lose your job and you have financed your home, your car, your appliances, your television, like all of these television, today would be a television, your radio. So now you're out of work. You've lost your savings in the stock market. The banks have failed because people have run to the banks and taken all their money. So you lost money that was, safe in the bank. And now you have all of these expenses with no income and no savings. And it's gonna put a lot of pressure on a lot of people. And that's really why this was a Great Depression, is because of all of these issues that had just stacked up. It overwhelmed the American public economically. In addition to that, the poor farmers. So I've said before that farmers did not share in this prosperity of the Roaring 20s. Crop prices were high during the war, and they're going to drop due to the high supply after the war. In addition to that, in the 1920s, there were new technologies, so chemical fertilizers. You have gasoline-powered tractors, so you can harvest more. You can protect your, with the fertilizers, you're going to grow more crops, like irrigation systems, things that would help farmers have more consistency in growing their crops, which is something that plagued farmers for generations before. Like 100 years ago, a farmer would lose his entire year's or season's harvest to drought or to flooding, and obviously that was what was hard about being a farmer. But in the 1920s, is the fact that they were so productive, is that they drove the price of their crops down. And so as the Depression continues, it's going to be worse and worse for farmers, especially in the Great Plains, because you're going to have the Dust Bowl. In the 1930s, it's going to be this trifecta of basically they've overworked the soil. So there's not a lot of topsoil left in that region. It's not the best region for growing crops like this anyways. Like it's supposed to be grassland. So they've overproduced the soil, so it's depleted of its nutrients. Not a lot of topsoil left. They're going to have an extreme drought. And so a lot of that topsoil is like there's no root system to like hold it down. And then there are going to be these this is the craziest part. Like there are like, yeah, you deplete soil. Yeah, you have drought. But the worst thing were these winds that kind of came in, and it created basically like this form of like static electricity with this wind and between the dust particles. And it was a storm that just could not stop these winds that kept coming in, and which took even more soil. And it created a situation where a lot of farmers had to leave their homesteads, their farms, and they were migrants. So Dust Bowl migrants were a thing. Many of them moved out west towards California. They had the nickname Okies. Whether you were from Oklahoma or not, I actually had a student a few years ago that was from California and that had moved to North Carolina. And when I was teaching this, she was like, "Oh, like we still use the term Okies, but they just call like country kids Okies. Like anyone that's from like the country that's not a city kid, they call them Okies." And so that's kind of like a long-term, kind of interesting. So in addition to a weak farm economy and everything else, these government policies, 1920s had complete faith that the businesses were to run as they wanted to, little or no control. Congress enacted those high tariffs to promote industry. It's going to hurt farmers. Like that's the crazy thing, is farmers are struggling in the 1920s and they don't do anything about it except for raise tariffs, which hurts farmers even more. The reason that a high tariff hurts farmers is because the cost of, and this is something we've been talking about, you guys, since the Federalists with Hamilton versus Jefferson, right? Is that when you increase that tariff on foreign imports, okay, that raises the cost for farmers to buy basic. But in addition to that, farmers depended on selling their crops to foreign nations. But when we slap a tariff on Germany, oh, that's a bad example because it's after World War I. When we slap a tariff on France, France is going to slap a tariff on our farmers in retaliation, okay? The Federal Reserve allowed for lots of these banks to end up just failing. That's not something that we do anymore. We've learned from our mistake. So if you remember the bank bailout, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac during the Great Recession, where they bailed out the banks to prevent them from failing, the reason that we did that was because we knew that if we didn't, it could lead to a depression, that the banks are crucial for economic development and recovery. And even though it doesn't seem fair, because in a lot of, especially with the Great Recession, the banks were kind of at fault because they overlended in these subprime mortgages. They were kind of at fault for why we were in this recession. However, they are such an important institution for that economic recovery that we had to bail them out. And some people were very critical of that, but this is why, if you have an understanding of history, it's important understanding that we have to have the banks. The Fed stuck hard to the gold standard, even though the vast majority of the wealth is, again, concentrated at the top, those haves, when we talked about the haves and the have-nots. And without depositors' insurance, like, again, people were scared they were going to lose their money. So there were the bank runs, they withdrew their money, the banks closed. And those bank failures are really going to be kind of a long-term problem. And it's one of the things that FDR is going to try and fix when he comes to office in 1932. nations had become more interdependent because of international banking and manufacturing and trade after World War I. The U.S. really didn't recognize the fact that these post-war problems were going to, especially with like the loan repayment. So we continued our high tariff policies. That's going to weaken Europe. We're going to default on the Dawes plan, which we were originally paying money to Germany so that Germany could, with interest, so that Germany could pay Britain and France and the war reparations, and then Britain and France owed us money. And so all of that being connected, when our economy starts to crash, it affects everyone else. Even today, like when you look at like Asian markets versus the European market and the US, all of those things affect like our stock market. So, when we look at, Asia's obviously like kind of like a day ahead of us. We look at how those markets are going, and then that's going to actually affect our stock market as well. So it's definitely this interconnected global economy is going to lead to it, to this depression. So effects. The worst the depression was in 1932. When you look at recovery, we're not going to have complete recovery until after World War II. The gross national product, so we think of it today as like the GDP, that's the value of all goods and services produced within the United States in 1 year. It's going to drop from 104 billion to 56 billion between 1929 and 1932. So it's going to decrease by about 50%. 20% of all American banks are going to close, and that leaves out, when I say that it closes, if you would imagine that like your class, like our classroom, everyone has money in the same bank, like in their community, right? Let's say that a quarter of the class says like their thought process is that this is going on, and they're like, well, I've already lost money in the stock market. I heard that the banks are not very strong. I'm going to go to the bank and I'm going to withdraw all my money. So a quarter of the class goes and does that, and they withdraw all their money. Now we know that the banks don't have all your money sitting in the bank. The purpose of the bank is not to protect it's to protect your money, but they use your money to loan out to other people, and they make money off of it. It still doesn't. We let that happen. But anyways, but that's our line of credit. That's the credit system. So when people in that quarter of the class goes to take out all the money in the bank, and then it's all gone, the bank has literally no more money to loan out, and the remaining 75% of the class, you've lost all your money. Okay, so when the banks close, people lose their savings. And so bank runs are a horrible idea. Don't ever do that. Keep your money in the bank. But again, today we have something called the FDIC, which insures your bank. It protects it. It gives you some confidence, and that's one of the New Deal programs. So as banks fails, the money supply contracts. 13 million people are unemployed by 1933, so it's 25% of the population. It doesn't include farmers. Farmers are living in their own poverty as it exists, and that's still about 40% of the population. In addition to that, African Americans, it was even worse. They're at 50% unemployment because they're the first ones that are going to be fired, the last to be hired in a company, or just like even like general work. The crash is going to end, and this is that turning point, this Republican-dominated government. People are going to realize like maybe this wasn't how we should be running our government, and that it kind of led to this depression. The social effects, all classes, obviously there are wealthy people that fell really far. Some people made it out okay. Farmers and African Americans probably had it the worst. It put a lot of stress on families. So if you think about unemployment, losing their homes, evictions, homeless people lived in things called Hoovervilles, and there's an image of that behind me, where these like little shanty towns, because they would lose their homes and their farms. If you were able to like keep your home or to find somewhere more affordable to live and like pay rent, sometimes one of the things that families would have to resort to doing is if you were a upper middle class or a middle class family and you had 3 or 4 kids, you might not have been able to feed them during the Great Depression because you have inconsistent work. And so one of the things that they did do, so it's called farming out your children, where like you would find relatives that could maybe like help, feed your kids, to where like one kid would go stay with this aunt and maybe one kid would go stay with a grandparent, in order to, because no family, even if you still had a job, like maybe your wages were cut or your hours were cut back, one more mouth to feed was a big deal. So no one would want the burden of 4 children financially, and so they would farm them out. They would send them to different people. Divorce rate or abandonment increased during the 1930s. A lot of men struggled with not being able to provide for their family, and so like literal depression, like mental illness and mental health was a big issue, where men abandoned their families because they were worried that they couldn't look at their starving children. It was a really rough time for sure in American history. So how did Hoover respond? And I think Hoover gets a bad rap for this because, again, he and the Republicans were thinking that this was a part of the business cycle, that if we keep our hands out of it, it will correct itself. It's not the job of the government to fix this problem. He asks businesses not to cut wages. He asks unions not to go on strike. He asked private charities to help increase their efforts and provide services to the homeless and unemployed. He believed strongly in rugged individualism, that the people need to help each other, that the government shouldn't intervene, that they need to help one another, they need to help themselves, they need to work harder. And unfortunately, that wasn't going to do it. You can't just request that, people do the right thing because they're worried about themselves. So by the summer of 1930, Hoover realized, though, that like this is not working. So it's like a year and a half of just like a huge shift in the American economy. He realized that there might need to be some government action. So they kind of went with their go-to game plan and they increased tariffs. So they passed the Hawley-Smoot tariff. Highest tariff in American history. It went from 31% to 49% on imports. And this is going to make things way, way worse. In retaliation, European nations enacted even higher tariffs on American goods. It's going to decrease global trade by 40%. This was a really bad idea. They're going to suspend the Dawes Plan in 1931. Next thing that he looks at is farmers. Okay, well, how can we help the farmers stabilize these prices in some sort of way? So they offered like, okay, well, you've got all this extra grain. Well, how about the government like holds on to it to try and stabilize prices? Well, that didn't work. So then they created this farm holiday where in order to affect the prices, the problem was that the supply was too high. Well, what if you lower the supply? So they asked farmers to stop harvesting grain. And so they were burning crops, they were slaughtering livestock, they poured milk out, into fields. And it's super ironic because in cities, there are people that are starving, and that are having a hard time like paying or finding food for their families. Meanwhile, out west and in the South, they are destroying crops in order to regulate the price. And it didn't really work. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation the goal was to help top businesses, top corporations, railroads, banks, life insurance companies, any type of like financial institution. So think of it as like a bailout. The goal was to stabilize those businesses, and that through this trickle down theory, and this is something that Republicans will also, which is also very interesting to me because it didn't work in the 1920s. So I'm not really sure why they thought it would work in the future, but Republicans will also use the same economic theory in the future, but that the recovery would trickle down to small businesses and like employees, etc. Unfortunately, it does help the top for sure. It helps those businesses, it helps those executives, it helps the factory owners and the railroad owners. But again, the whole idea of trickle down is that people do the right thing and that they make sure that their wages are right and that they're not firing people, but instead they like hang on tight to their money. And that's the idea of trickle down, is that, you give corporations a tax break. And the idea is, and the reason they do that is they say, hey, we'll give you a tax break so you don't have that burden on your business, in hopes that, and how they've kind of push it or persuade is that, hey, maybe you should provide healthcare to your employees, or maybe you should raise wages for your employees. But again, they're all suggestions. And unfortunately, throughout history, those corporations and those businesses don't always do it. Some might, but not all of them do. So that didn't work. In addition to that, just bad PR. There were a lot of World War I veterans that were promised a kind of like a pension, like a bonus for serving in World War I. Now, originally the legislation said that they would get it in 1945, almost like a retirement bonus. So if you think that, it'd be like 20, 25 years after the war. But the bonus marchers were veterans that marched on DC asking for, they're saying like, hey, I can't feed my family. Like, I'm about to lose my home. I want my bonus now. Well, the Republicans of this period, very like fiscally conservative. You remember that like, Harding and Coolidge, they all like their goal was to like reduce spending. They were like, no, we don't have the money for that now, because tax revenue, like as people lose jobs, remember, they're not paying income tax anymore. They're paying less income tax, which is a really important revenue for the federal government. In addition to that, the other form of revenue for the federal government are tariffs. Well, global trade is down, so we're losing money that way. So the federal government for sure has less money. And so they're like, no, we can't afford it. We're not giving you those bonuses. And then so they're camped out, and you can see this, like the Capitol building, where they're camped out and they're demonstrating. And Hoover gets so frustrated by it that he brings Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur, who's going to be used in World War II, to break up these veterans, and he's using American tanks and tear gas on World War I veterans. It's just a bad PR move. So public opinion, in addition to how they've handled the Depression or the economic instability, is going to, Americans don't like Hoover. And so they'll call their little shanty towns Hoovervilles. If a Hoover flag is like, if you're broke, like you would like pull your pockets out, like outward, and like you would have the white flags like of surrender or whatever. Like you got no money, that's a Hoover flag. A Hoover blanket was a newspaper, because you're homeless, you're sleeping on a park bench, you put a newspaper over you as a blanket. He was not very popular. So FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is going to be the Democratic presidential nominee in 1932. He was New York governor, and what he did when he campaigned is he promised a New Deal to help Americans. And they were ready for change. Like it was a landslide. All but 6 states elected him. Both houses of Congress also won large Democratic majorities because they were just frustrated with the Republican response to the Depression. Now, what I do think is interesting is that Hoover, by this point, I think that I don't think that pride was an issue for him. Some people would be very like prideful and be like, well, I lost, and, uncooperative. Hoover, I think, tried. Like he did reach out to FDR. He said, hey, you say you got this New Deal plan. Like, what do we need to do in order to get things going? Which is also very similar. So the Great Recession started in the fall of 2008. Like just as Obama was getting elected in 2008. Now, granted, Bush was not running for re-election, but a member of his party did lose to Obama. And a lot of the causes of what happened, like a lot of the causes that caused the Great Recession did have a lot to do with like the Bush era tax cuts and kind of this Republican economic policy. And I think Bush, he went to Obama, and they worked together. They got some legislation already passed during Bush's administration. It was there's a lot of bipartisanship there between the Obama administration and the Bush administration to like what's best for the American people. So a lot of those bailouts were done under the Bush administration, with help with the incoming Obama administration. So that was a really good example of bipartisanship coming together. FDR, though, he was like, no, I'm good. Like, I got my plan. We'll wait till March. Because remember, at this point in time, this was before the 20th Amendment. So inauguration was March 4th. So, and this is one of the reasons that you have the 20th Amendment being passed and ratified, is because so many Americans were so done with Hoover, and all they wanted was FDR to be president and to implement his New Deal, but they had to wait until March. So November, December, January, February, 5 more months they had to wait. And that was one of the reasons that they passed the 20th Amendment, to move inauguration day to January 20th. So you only had really a month after the electoral votes would be counted. And here's the landslide that I spoke of. Even though popular vote wise, which is kind of crazy, like you can imagine, like, I mean, 57% of the popular vote, 89% of the electoral vote, though. So a little bit more about FDR, because his background, I think, is important for how he envisioned his role as the presidency. He's going to be the only president that was elected to 4 terms. He was very popular during the Depression, and he was up for re-election right at the eve of World War II. So war had broken out, or Hitler was being aggressive in Europe, and he was extremely popular. And I think his thought was, I don't know if I trust anyone else to lead us into this moment. And I do think that we're probably right. Like when we get to World War II and we talk about his leadership there, he knew how bad that war was going to be and how bad Hitler was. And I do think that his leadership was important. He was elected to his 4th term, and he died very early in that 4th. He didn't actually serve out his 4th term, but he was elected to 4 terms. So he's a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, and he always looked up to him. He kind of almost like followed his footsteps. So started in the New York legislature. He was assistant secretary of the Navy like Teddy, ran as a vice presidential candidate, but lost. Their parties are different though, but like their views on government were very similar, which is interesting, because I don't like Teddy Roosevelt. He was a Republican, and there were certain parts of the things that he agreed with that was Republican policy, but then there were some things that are more like the progressive views were very like in line with Democratic views. And that was what I really liked and appreciated about Teddy Roosevelt, is that he was not like a straight party ticket person. Like he was going to, depending on the issue, he had different views on what he thought was right. His wife, Eleanor, is going to be FDR's wife, Eleanor, is probably going to be the most influential first lady. She sets the tone. She sets the precedent for future first ladies. She had FDR's ear, and she actually encouraged him to have for diversity, to use African Americans and women. He was a little bit more stubborn on that. So anytime you saw a woman or an African American that was being appointed to a position, like she was the one that spoke in that regard. She believed in lifting up these underserved like communities with leadership, leaders within their communities. Teddy Roosevelt, FDR is also really interesting because in 1921, and he was very athletic and really struggled with the fact that he was paralyzed by polio in 1921, but he was really strong and he worked hard. Again, with Eleanor really kind of encouraging him. He did fall into some depression. And so he was paralyzed. Like he had, braces. There's only like 1 or 2 pictures of him actually photographed in his wheelchair. But imagine today, a disabled man or woman that would be running for president. Like it's kind of interesting. Remember there's no television. So people could hear him on the radio, and they could see photographs like this, for example. So one of the things that they had worked out for campaigning to seem strong, right, is that, which I think is silly. Like I think obviously that anyone should be able to run for president, no matter whether they can walk or not. But one of the things that they had figured out is like, hey, well, let's have photo ops of him riding in a car, and let's get him strong enough to where he can stand with his son to campaign. So he can stand. So he would like lock his braces in and use like his core strength to stand up for those photo ops. But other than that, like it really wasn't an issue to people, because it's not like you were on video camera where you had to see all the transitions and everything. from wheelchair to standing. So, and then no one was allowed to take pictures of him in his wheelchair. Really interesting figure. Again, like more than any president, he expanded the size of the federal government. He altered the scope of how the federal government operates. He enlarged presidential powers with some pushback. One of the most influential leaders in the world of the 20th century, no doubt about it. So, what is his New Deal? It is a program or a series of programs that will provide relief for the people out of work, recovery for the businesses and the economy as a whole, and reform these economic institutions that have failed us in the 1920s. And it's going to all be done through federal legislation, like big government, you guys, big government. So his brain trusts, as he called them, are his economic advisors. Most of them were university professors. They've studied economic policy and theories. They are like eggheads. He is going to appoint the most diverse administrative, like high administrative within the federal government, the most diverse in American history. Not until more recent years have we, I think, and even President Biden, to what it seems when you look at a lot of his appointees, it looks like he's really making a goal of increasing diversity with the number of women, like the ratio of women to men, with other like ethnic minorities. And so FDR and again, with FDR, I think that was Eleanor in his ear. He's going to appoint African Americans, Catholics, and Jews, which I know sounds kind of crazy, but remember that they were still discriminated against at this point because of their religious views. And then he's also going to appoint women. So Frances Perkins is going to be the first woman to ever serve in a presidential cabinet, but not the last. And so in the first 100 days, the 73rd Congress will pass 15 major pieces of legislation, and all of them are related to his New Deal policy. They are going to enact more pieces of legislation than any other Congress in history, and I do believe that record still holds. So I'm not going to talk about all the New Deal policy or programs because we're going to talk about that in class and we're going to do an activity associated with it. This would be a 2-hour lecture if I talked about each New Deal policy, but I will talk about the Emergency Banking Relief Act. So the number one thing that FDR and his financial advisors have talked about is like, these banks can't fail. Like Hoover let them fail, and that's why we're kind of in this position. And so depositors are continuing to withdraw all their funds, which means that you have no credit system. Like people can't borrow money to buy a house, which stimulates the economy. They can't borrow money to buy a car, which helps stimulate the auto industry. They can't start a new business, which would create jobs. Like, because there's no credit, none of these things can happen. And he has to restore confidence. And this is one of the things I think that FDR made some big mistakes in his administration, in his years. And I think that the increase in the federal government was a big change. But I do think one of the things that was great about FDR was his leadership and what he knew Americans needed at that time, and it was confidence. So the first thing that they do is the Emergency Banking Relief Act. This is going to create a bank holiday. It's going to close all the banks. No one can go in and take out the money. Just stop. Okay. But what they also need to do is reorganize. They need to see what banks were high risk of failing, which ones were like good to go. How can we support these banks so that they don't fail? And so that's really important. So while the banks were closed, though, he had his first of many fireside chats. March 12th, my birthday. He gets on the radio and he explains it to the American people. He says, listen, that phrase where like the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He actually explains it to the American people. You are making this worse for us. And it's because they don't know. If you think about like the education, especially for, vast majority of people are rural or, lack education or, in cities and whatever. And he gets on the radio because everybody's got a radio because they bought it on credit in the 1920s. And he says like, hey, listen, we've closed down the banks. we have to have the banks around, like just bottom line. Please go put your money back in the bank. Don't keep it under your mattress. Like deposit your money, put your paychecks there. You know, if you need to buy a new car, like go to the bank and take out a loan. Like they'll work with you. Like we need to help. We need to put some confidence in our banks so that our economy can grow. Okay. And what he also used his fireside chats for was explaining, like every time that there was a new program that came out, he would say, hey, you know, the Works Progress Administration is this new organization, and we have all of these jobs available to you to where we're going to rebuild, you know, we're going to build city parks, and we're going to, you know, take this time to invest in our infrastructure. Like if you need a construction job, like, hey, head down to your local WPA. Like he would kind of talk them through it. And what that did is it made Americans not be as fearful anymore. And if you have more confidence and you feel hopeful about the future, you're going to get out of this depression, right? You're going to try to do your part in making sure that these programs are successful. So the New Deal programs, the original New Deal programs, there's a first New Deal and there's a second New Deal. The first New Deal was really focused on recovery. Let's get people to work. What government buildings need to be rebuilt? How can we get people to work? And by the way, the federal government is footing the bill for all this. They dug trails and cleared out forests to prevent forest fires. They built bridges and dams. They brought electricity to rural areas. All of these things, they were like, listen, what needs to be done in order to make our country better? Let's invest in it now. Let's spend the money. People need the jobs. Let's spend the money now. And so a lot of like the bridges and highways and like national parks, like state parks, like Hanging Rock State Park, which is not so far from us, those trails were carved out, and the lodge and like the building where like you go check in there, that was built during the Great Depression with the PWA, I believe. And so that was the goal of his program in getting people back to work. So the first New Deal is really about recovery, some relief in there as well. His second New Deal is a little bit more aggressive. It was really focusing on how can we need to give direct relief to the people. There are people that still need help. We just need to give them some money to get them by. But also we need to reform a lot of these institutions that led to this problem. Like we're going to have to regulate these banks and regulate the stock market. But he waited until re-election. Okay, or excuse me, he waited until midterm elections. So the midterms in 1934, more Democratic wins. And so FDR, much like how Lincoln saw it as an affirmation. So like during the Civil War, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. He wins re-election in 1864. He sees that as affirmation that the American people are doing, even though he barely won. This affirmation, and so that's why he pursued the 13th Amendment. Same thing with FDR. Now they don't have as much time. So midterm elections, he's like, hey, I think the people approve of what we're doing. And so then he starts moving this much more aggressive wave of second New Deal policies that look at direct relief, like giving money to the states to give money to the people. So like unemployment, like today we have Social Security because Social Security was a part of the second New Deal program. But before even that, they were like giving money to the states with the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, to where people would show up and they say, hey, I've been out of work. I can't find any work. I got to pay my rent. I got to pay the grocer, like, because you would take out loans from that. I can't feed my kids. And then they would give you a check. So it's basically an early form of like Social Security with like unemployment. So much more aggressive, much more big government, especially like long-standing programs that are still around today. So in 1936, the economy is still weak all the way at that point, despite the government spending the billions of dollars that they're spending. However, he's popular. He's popular with workers, with farmers, north, south. Now, businesses don't really like him because he is kind of like pro-union. They're regulating the governments. They're regulating the businesses now. There's the Wagner Act, which allows for collective bargaining. It's one of the things that you're going to look at. And so in 1936, Republican Governor Alf Landon is challenging him. And the Republicans are criticizing FDR and the Democrats because it's too much spending. Remember, that's their view of like fiscal conservative. And they're also worried, I think, about long term, which I think is a fair criticism, is like, how are you going to keep affording Social Security? Right. We're in 2021 and we are like, yeah, Social Security is going to bank. People make jokes about how like, well, I'll never get my Social Security. Yet it's this big chunk of money that comes out of my paycheck every year or every month. So even though he was worried about the future, this is Landon, and a little bit critical, there were some programs that he liked that he felt were working, at least for the morale of the country. FDR is going to, a true landslide, he's going to win every state except Maine and Vermont. He's going to have 60% of the popular vote. Like, those are things that we don't even see anymore. And what he forms, most importantly, this is important, is I call it the New Deal Coalition. Sometimes they call it the Democratic Coalition. It's going to be from the 1930s to the 1960s. And Southerners, white ethnic groups in cities, Midwestern farmers, labor unions, liberal progressives, democratic socialists, they're all going to vote with the Democratic Party for that 30, 40-year time span. Okay. In addition to that, African Americans are going to leave the Republican Party. Even though New Deal policy programs actually discriminated against African Americans, they felt like it was better than what the Republican Party had offered them. And statistically, Democrats have continued to vote with the Democratic Party ever since then. But most of that has to do with the civil rights movement. So when people talk about like the big switch, I guess, with the political parties, in the 1930s is when African Americans are going to leave the party of Lincoln, because it's no longer the party of Lincoln. They're going to leave the Republican Party and they're going to go with FDR. And a lot of it has to do with Eleanor Roosevelt and how she advocated for African Americans. But a huge voting bloc of Democrats within these years. Now, things are going to change in the 1960s with the civil rights movement. That's the switch that a lot of people talk about. Not everybody liked FDR. There are liberal critics, so left-wing people. These are socialists, and they criticized the New Deal, especially the first one, because it didn't do enough for people. There was not enough direct relief. They were more in line with the second New Deal because it was much more progressive. It was much more liberal. Not only did it reform, but it provided a lot more direct relief. Conservative critics say government's too big, too much power. They believed that some of these acts were like borderline socialism and communism, because you have like the WPA, you have people working for the federal government for wages. And I guess that was their justification there. And then the Wagner Act just like takes power away from businesses because it allowed for unions to use collective bargaining. Another big concern is deficit financing, is like, we don't have the money to pay for these things, so we're going to borrow money. So that's true because we still borrow money and we're trillions of dollars in debt. The American Liberty League was this anti-New Deal organization that their goal was like, this is going to ruin the U.S. economic and political system, because it was a drastic change than anything had ever happened in the past. It was for sure a political and economic turning point in how American politicians use the power of the federal government to affect economic change. And we're, with the 2020 pandemic right now, like when you look at how Republicans and Democrats are arguing over these stimulus packages and these checks that they're just writing to people because they know that the economy's been affected by this health pandemic. At first, right, everyone was on board when unemployment was high during the summer months because everything had shut down. Now, as the economy's kind of opened up a bit, but there are still certain groups of people that are struggling financially and that had to go into a lot of credit card debt because they lost their job and there was no help. That's where you see the Democrats and the Republicans kind of arguing like, well, we can't just give handouts all the time. And then there are, on the Republican side, the more conservative side, and then there are Democrats that are saying, like, these people need help. And so you can see that they're worried about the government, the size of the government, and then also like the fact that people need help, and they're just kind of going back and forth. Other opponents, so you have Father Charles Coughlin. He was a Catholic priest. He called for like issues with like money. He wanted to inflate the currency. He wanted to take over all the banks. It's a little bit of socialism. However, he was anti-Semitic, and so that kind of like a downfall for him. Francis Townsend, Dr. Francis Townsend, really advocated for the elderly. So this was before Social Security. Basically, they stole like Townsend's idea for Social Security. He proposed a 2% sales tax that would be used to create a special retirement fund for anyone over 60. So instead of it being a sales tax, it was kind of like an income tax that they took out. That's what Social Security is. And it puts it in this little fund, and the government writes you a check when you hit, 65. Now it's like 65 and a half or 67 and a half because we're running out of money. Huey Long was a senator from Louisiana. He was a socialist. He talked about the share our wealth system, where he promised which is kind of funny because this is now like something being proposed by Democratic politicians today, where it's a minimum annual income of $5,000 for every American family to be paid by taxing the wealthy. Yeah, that probably sounds familiar. He announced that he was going to run for president in 1935 and was assassinated shortly after because that was some radical left wing. It's a little bit too radical for the majority of Americans. It's radical for today, I think some people see. Supreme Court and the New Deal. So Supreme Court starts striking down some programs. They're going to strike down the NRA, not the National Rifle Association, the National Recovery Act, and then also the Agricultural Adjustment Agency. And FDR doesn't like that. And so he has this crazy idea, and it comes back to bite him in the butt, about, I have the ability to add Supreme Court justices. And so he starts talking about this idea. Americans, Republicans, Democrats, everyone was very critical of him. He's like, no, like this is a bad precedent. Eventually, it's funny, he never had to pack the court because eventually the Supreme Court they held up the Wagner Act, they held up Social Security. So they started like coming on his side a little bit. And so he was okay with that. Plus, there are two justices that retired in his second term. And so he got to put more liberal justice there that was more pro-New Deal. And so that kind of solved that problem. But it was a very scary time when you look at what is this guy doing? He's stealing too much power. Unions are going to gain a lot of rights during the 1930s. They're going to have power with the Wagner Act. It's going to give them the legal right to unionize and to use collective bargaining. You're going to have, so you have the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. Now you have a new one, the Congress of Industrial Workers. They're going to break away. So you have more skilled labor in the AFL, and the CIO is more unskilled. So automobile steel. So it was a very big union, and they're going to gain more power. So because collective bargaining is protected by the federal government, originally, General Motors and some companies are going to resist that a little bit, but eventually they're going to open up and they're going to start negotiating, especially with those strikes. A really important piece of legislation is the Fair Labor Standards Act that comes out of the Great Depression, and that's going to establish a federal minimum wage, overtime pay, so a 40-hour work week, and then a few more things in regards to child labor and things like that, or youth labor. So between 1933 and 1937, the economy improved a little bit. So it's going to drop from 25% unemployment to 15% unemployment. However, as the Social Security tax goes into effect in that winter of 1937, there's going to be a recession. So between people's paychecks are being a little bit smaller because of Social Security. In addition to that, the government is spending more money on direct relief, like money to people. And the public works jobs, so there's going to be a slight recession. People are worried about like the spending. FDR at first tries to reduce spending in order to kind of balance the budget, but there was a leading economist of the time, John Maynard Keynes. He's British, and he had this theory that said that's the wrong decision. Is that that deficit spending is one way to like basically spend your way out of a depression. And even today, Republicans and Democrats use deficit spending in order to during economic downturn. It's called pump priming. So the private sector isn't going to stimulate the economy on its own. So instead, let's let the federal government prime the pump, right? Use government money to keep the economy going until the private sector can catch up. So for example, all of those jobs that they were creating during the Great Depression, that's not the private sector creating those jobs, it's the federal government. Now, long term, you look at like, well, where does that shift go? Like, when does that transition happen? Where, because the government can't pay these people forever. And that was some of the criticism. So in 1938, FDR and his advisors start using this strategy. They start deficit spending. And obviously there's going to be some criticism there, but there was also at this point, like, what else do we do? Like, do we go back? Do we start laying off these workers and stop building these things? And so that was the decision that they made. And we still use that. We still use Keynesian economics today. So for women during the Depression was a hard time. So most of the time they're helping to supplement income. Some men accuse women of taking jobs away from men. Despite New Deal programs that allowed women to work within those programs, they were still paid lower wages because they were a woman, in addition to everything that they needed to do as like wives and mothers. This is a famous photograph, obviously. This was called Migrant Mother. This woman is like 35 years old and her husband had just died. She's a migrant worker, working on farms. She was, I guess, an Okie, if you will, during the Dust Bowl. And she was photographed by Dorothea Lange, who was a photographer that worked for the Works Progress Administration. So one of the aspects of the WPA was that they paid artists, photographers, anyone and everyone, they paid people to get historical records of former slaves. Like, they were just trying to think, like, well, what, like, in the humanities, like, what can we do in order to put these people to work, but also like benefit overall? And so they paid these photographers to document the struggles of the Great Depression. And Dorothea Lange was one of the more famous photographers. And this is that famous image that you probably associate with the Great Depression. For African Americans, obviously discrimination is still going to be an issue. They are underemployed. They have the highest unemployment rate. Sharecroppers were forced off their land to because remember, farmers with supply was an issue. A lot of the New Deal policies excluded them from any state and local relief. That was one of my criticisms of FDR and the New Deal, was that they allowed for states to discriminate. So like the state of Mississippi, if they were given federal money, federal relief packages to give to their citizens, they wouldn't give them to African Americans, right? And the federal government allowed for that to happen. There's going to be a lot of racial tension because it's going to be about jobs. And so lynchings continue to happen. The WPA and the CCC did not provide jobs to Black Americans. And if they did, that they were often segregated. So it wasn't, which is interesting too, because like African Americans were voting for FDR, even though there were these discriminatory policies. The Homeowners Loan Corporation did not give out loans to African Americans to buy their own homes. Lots of different examples of discrimination. One of the reasons I think that they did support FDR was because he appointed African Americans to certain positions. Mary McLeod Bethune is going to the first middle level position of the federal government by an African American woman. A. Philip Randolph in the Fair Employment Practice Committee. That was something that FDR gave him permission or appointed him to do, that to look at how the private sector were employing African Americans and to kind of demand those equal job opportunities for them. Now, granted, Randolph had to like threaten marching on Washington, but still, there was some progress there. For American Indians, they're going to create the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1933. Some of those CC projects, so the Civilian Conservation Corps projects, are going to be on reservations to try and help some American Indians. And then you have the Indian Reorganization Act, which is going to repeal the Dawes Act way back when. And basically what it's going to do is it's going to give more power to American Indians on those reservations versus the federal government. Sounds nice in theory, but remember, we now have, 50 odd years, like generations worth of like inexperience on the reservation in order to like establish their own government. And so it's going to be really shaky. Like we didn't really, basically imagine like taking over a country, ruling them the way you want to for 50 years, and then all of a sudden saying, oh, never mind, like you get to rule yourself now. Good luck. And like, that's it. And not providing any type of like financial resources for it. So long-term, maybe not the greatest thing. But you did have for sure, I think the positive side was like the preservation of culture, where before, like under the Dawes plan, it was like, no, you must be a Christian and you must farm and you must do all these things. So the good news is that they have more autonomy in how they want to support their culture and their language. For Mexican Americans, were greatly discriminated during the Great Depression. In the 1920s, they were vital in agriculture in the Southwest and in the South. They were migrant workers once the Depression hit and that high unemployment. And then obviously the drought and the Dust Bowl in the Great Plains. There were a lot of white migrant workers, and so there were no longer jobs for them. New Deal policies did discriminate them and force them to go back to Mexico and not come back. And so they really struggled during this time period. So overall, that's the end of the Great Depression in our lecture. We are going to start talking about in the next lecture about how we're transitioning and what's going on foreign policy-wise. So this is all FDR dealing with the Depression itself. One of the reasons that the United States was like for sure against joining the Allied powers and supporting the Allied powers is because they wanted to focus on the American economy. Even though FDR had a lot of concerns about the rise of Hitler and fascism and appeasement by British and French leaders. So we will talk about that in the next lecture. I hope you learned something today, and I will see you next time. Bye.